Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Clare McNeil, Director of the Timewise Innovation Unit, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar this afternoon for the launch of our annual Flexible Working Index. This year, our publication is in partnership with the Lloyds Banking Group. Now, the Timewise Index is in its 9th year, and this is the largest survey of its kind looking at the volume of jobs advertised flexibly in the UK. I'm sure that many of you are joining us from home today, and that's an indication of just how much the world of work has changed in the past few years. We know that the majority of people in this country want to work flexibly, 9 in 10 of us. But the index that we published today shows that just 3 in 10 people have jobs advertised flexibly, and too few people can actually access good flexible work. Now, Timewise has been fighting to shift the dial on flexible working for the past 17 years. Our mission is to create stronger, more inclusive workplaces with greater access to flexible working for everyone. And we do this in 2 key ways. Firstly, by working with employers to really empower teams and to transform company cultures, and also by changing attitudes and working to influence policymakers. And one of our recent successes has been advocating for the flexible working legislation, which will be introduced by the government next year. This legislation can change millions of lives, potentially by increasing access to flexible working, by making the right to request a day one right. But we know that that will only happen if more people, including those who work in frontline occupations and from disadvantaged groups, feel that they really can have the right conversations at work about flexible working. So that's what today's discussion is all about. We have a fantastic panel joining us today, and we'll hear from them shortly. I'm afraid that Danny Mortimer from NHS Employers has had to drop out due to negotiations with medical unions, but we have a very full session ahead of us today. Just a bit of housekeeping. We'll have some time for questions at the end. Please do put your questions in the Q&A, where I'll be able to put them to the panel. Anything else, please put into the chat. And we'll also be running a couple of live polls during the event. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Clare Campbell, Timewise's newly appointed CEO. Clare runs the organisation while herself working a 4-day week working pattern. So over to you, Clare.
Lovely. Good afternoon, everyone. And I hope it seems to be brightening up a bit here. I hope it's not too murky where you are. For those that haven't met me, yes, I'm the new chief exec of Timewise, so week 3, but getting my head around the organisation because I've been with Timewise since 2016 and led our employer consulting team through that time. So worked with many employers on their journeys around flexible working and watched how the landscape has changed over the last few years. So I'm really pleased to be bringing you our Flexible Jobs Index results for this year and to kick off today's conversation. So, you know, this at the heart of this is how easy is it if you're a candidate looking for flexible work to see that there are roles you can apply for and progress. As Clare said, this is our 9th year tracking, and just in terms of methodology, for anyone who's curious, we work with an organisation called Lightcast, and they've scanned over a 6-month period, they scanned 5.7 million vacancies to look for any reference to any kind of flexible working. So any broad search terms in there around part-time, hybrid, open to flexibility, anything like that, we'll have looked at it, counted it as part of our data set. We do exclude jobs that are below 20,000, below sort of living wage level, and we do exclude 0 hours, freelance, kind of temporary work, because we're really interested in the market for quality flexible jobs. So we noticed that, you know, post-pandemic, there was an uptake, but, you know, we've been waiting to see what would happen this year. Thank you, Lorna. Next. Yeah, there we go. So the headline, you know, as Clare touched on earlier, is that, you know, we've only seen a 1% change this year. So I think that was a disappointment to us, having seen a real jump, as you can see, by 9%, 20 to 21, 4%, 21 to 22. And then to see that it stalls this year with only a 1% improvement. And perhaps it's not a surprise, the rhetoric, you know, in the press this year has been around people feeling a little more uncertain about the levels of flexible working, particularly hybrid working that they've given, and whether they should be reining back a bit and bringing people back to the office. So perhaps it's not a surprise level, but for us, it's really out of kilter with what we know the demand for flexible working is, and actually the number of people who already work flexibly or have access to, occasional hybrid working or flexi hours. It's much higher than this. So what's the resistance to kind of, being open with candidates about what you're able to offer? Next one. Yeah, so our kind of problem in a nutshell is on this slide. 31% of jobs will offer flexibility, but we know from CIPD survey earlier this year and others that have been done that around 60% of people say they have access to some kind of flexible work, whether, as we said, that's flexi hours or hybrid working or some ability to choose their shifts. At least 60% of employees have that. And actually the demand is higher. Survey after survey have shown that there's, most people would like flexible working. It's as important to people as salary in some cases. And a survey we did recently, 87% of people said that they wanted to be able to work flexibly. So you've got, a very high demand for flexible working, and still only 31% of jobs offering it. So it does matter to people. And I think, as Claire touched on at the start, there are people who can't work unless they can access some kind of flexibility. And with the high cost of living, I think it's been also very important to people to see if they could flex their work in a way that would help them cope with childcare costs, caring costs, and other things as well. So it's a really high priority for candidates, but it seems, employers are not kind of on board with that yet. So in terms of types of flexibility, we like to take it down and look at, is there any major difference in the kind of flexibility that's on offer? And again, a disappointment here, part-time, which has been a bit of a poor relation the last few years to hybrid working, hasn't shifted. So we know around 30% of people work part-time. There's a really high demand for part-time jobs, and yet only 12% of jobs are available and advertised openly as part-time. Home working, there's been a little shift in hybrid work, as you might expect, but not enough to affect the overall level around home working, including hybrid working, which is still only 12%. And I think that one's particularly striking when you think how many people you know and you hear about working in a hybrid way. So that one feels that it's very out of kilter with the practice that's actually going on. Flexible hours, flexible shifts. This is something when we talk to candidates and do focus groups with employees, people really like flexibility. Can I come in a little bit late? Can I flex my hours around the other things that are going on? It's really popular and yet very rarely advertised. So this does also include, the ability to choose shifts, book on to, have self-rostering and in a sort of health environment. But yes, the people actually advertising that kind of level of flexi hours or flexi time or the ability to choose your shifts is really low. And then we've also seen a slight uptake in ads just referencing come and talk to us about flexible working or some flexible working available, but still that's at 11%. That still feels really low compared with what we know the reality is. And even that's with campaigns like Working Families have had a Happy to Talk flexible working campaign, and others have been pushing employers to say that you're open to flex, but still only 11% of ads do that. So we'd really like to see more employers openly advertising what they could do. I should say we also search, we do look at job share. We looked this year at 4-day week, but the numbers there are still too small to show up. So I think we'll watch 4-day week and we'll keep watching that with interest. But it isn't always a type of flexible working. I went to a conference earlier this year, and one story that struck me particularly hard was a lady who was running a very successful 4-day week organisation, but she said, we'd never advertise that. We don't want to attract the wrong kind of people. And I was a bit gobsmacked in the audience thinking, someone who wants to work 4-day week would be seen as not the kind of candidate they want to have. It's just evidence of that sort of flexism that's out there, that that someone who wants to work less might in some way be less committed to the organisation, which we know isn't true. Next, Lorna, thank you. We break down the picture by salary level. I think you can see there's sort of an inequality in the kind of flexible work that's available depending on the level you're at and the salary band you're at. Part-time, much more common in salary, sort of 20 to 34k. But if you up a level or two to salaries kind of 60k and over, there's a third the number of jobs advertised part-time. So we know there's demand at senior levels for part-time work, but it's much easier to find part-time work at lower levels of pay and role. And I think this is what we tend to see as the part-time trap. People find a job, perhaps in a school, perhaps in a health setting, where they can work, term time, or they can work shorter hours, and that works for them. So they don't bother trying to progress or looking around. They remain in that role that gives them the flexibility they need. On home working, the picture goes the other way. Much easier to get a job that allows you some hybrid working or some home working if you're in higher salary bands, and much less common for people in the 20 to 34k salary band. So again, that's sort of an inequality, whether it's because those roles are more frontline, sort of customer facing roles, but sometimes even elements of those jobs could be done from home. So it would be nice to see employers embracing it and making sure hybrid works at all levels. Okay, and then diving down again, if we take a sector lens, it's really interesting to look by role category. So part-time, you can see hospitality, education, health, much more common. You can find part-time roles, and of course these tend to be female dominated roles typically, education, hospitality, healthcare. So perhaps they're more used to having people who want to work different hours, different shifts, or want reduced hours to fit in with their outside work responsibilities. And by contrast, if you go part-time and where the lowest levels are, it's IT, it's engineering, construction. So again, it feels a bit gendered in terms of who has access to part-time working. Home working, a bit more prevalent in office jobs, I suppose. You see the higher levels there in HR, in IT, in marketing. So it feels like some office jobs are now on board with hybrid working, and they're using that to openly advertise. But we'd love to see this, like all the inequalities in here, shift. Certainly be nice to see more people advertising flex hours, because as I said, we know that's really, really popular. And then it's interesting. So if you think, we talked about the gender issue, but there are roles in there, HR, marketing, with very low levels of part-time. So again, thinking of that progression point, thinking how many people probably want to work part-time, would be really interesting to see how we could encourage greater advertising and access to part-time roles at all levels. So there's even more in the printed report, so do download it. It's got regional differences in there, so yeah, you'll find a little bit more to dig into and read at leisure. But the headline for us, as I said, it still feels like there's a big gap, and a slight disappointment that gap hasn't been closed since the pandemic, but employers are still not kind of totally on board with openly advertising flexibility. So we would say, the new legislation is obviously coming next year. This is going to mean candidates feel more confident to ask, and we'll have a higher expectation that employers will be open with them about the kinds of flexibility they can offer. So get ahead is our key message. Think now about what you're already doing in your organisation, what kind of flexibility works well. Get proactive by supporting managers. I think, very often it just seems easier to advertise the role in the way that it's always been advertised. But actually a conversation to say, what, if you put some time, put that this could be done 4 days a week, this could be done in a hybrid way. Let's just test it. Let's see how that affects the candidate numbers and the candidate quality. So, nudge managers, support managers to feel comfortable to have some of those conversations. It's a great route to widening the candidate pool. There's evidence out there, higher job applications, more diverse job applications. So it really fits well for employers who want to attract the best talent. And also right now, we hear from candidates that it's something that can help them manage living standards, living costs, particularly with the really high costs of childcare and other care. And finally, employers, be transparent in your adverts. This is a great sort of marketing tool. We know to many candidates, flexibility matters as much as salary. So, if you can put an offer in there, it's a great tool for attracting talent. For policymakers, we know the legislation's coming. It's that one-off opportunity that we've got to kind of, provide guidance to employers, make sure there's comprehensive support available so that people kind of feel more confident in how they can embrace the legislation and offer flexibility. But we'd also like to see, that message to reach all businesses. So that will be through making sure employment advisors and intermediaries feel confident in talking to employers about the benefits of hiring flexibly. And also we found a sector approach works really well in some of our Timewise projects over recent years, you know, because you've got to look at the operational constraints and the operational realities for the business. And so if you can work with others from the sector to think, right, in our industry, in our sector, what's going to work? What can we try? And share the learning. And that's very much the philosophy of our Pioneer programme. So I'm going to pause there. I hope that's given you an intro to the findings. Really interested to see the reactions from our panellists.
Fantastic, thank you, Claire. And as Claire says, there's plenty more detail in the report, so do download it. Before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to get you thinking about our first poll. So the question we're asking is, what percentage of employers has heard of the Day One flexible working legislation, which is coming in next year? You've got three choices: option 1, 25%, option 2, 66%, and option 3, 49%. So it's a cliffhanger. We'll come back to that after our next speaker. So I'd like to introduce Charlotte Holloway. Charlotte is Government Relations Director for UK and Ireland at Zoom. She's also a member of the government's Hybrid Work Commission on how the government can respond to the rise in hybrid and remote working in the UK. Charlotte's going to give us some insights into what Zoom is learning as an employer about flexible work, as well as her perspective as a member of the commission. So Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you to other Claire and the rest of the team for everything you've done to put this really cracking report yet again launching today. I think we certainly see that there's a huge benefit in this report and some of the key findings in it for helping, you know, people like myself, policymakers, people in the wider kind of world thinking deeply about hybrid, flexible work. This really helps us all in what's been produced today. So thank you very much. Zoom is always really pleased to speak at these kind of things, because we certainly have had a real front row seat with a lot of the companies and employers that we work with and how they deploy technology to enable them to get the best out of their workforce. We obviously saw that during the pandemic, where Zoom, you know, it tries to be quite humble about the growth that we experienced during that time, but also subsequent to the pandemic, the kind of relationships and partnerships we have with companies, with public sector organisations of all shapes and sizes, about how they're adapting to sort of what we're calling the new normal. Now, we basically see that we saw about a decade's worth of technological transformation happen in the space of 18 months over the pandemic. And now the kind of expectations of many employees, we find it, you know, in the customers we work with, are changing as well. You know, there's growing trends out there, as the team have highlighted: shorter working weeks, working away from the office, using technology. The workplace is really evolving to keep in step with the digital revolution. And there are more and more benefits that we're seeing, various studies coming forward that say employees are actually looking to sometimes take salary sacrifices in order to have more flexibility afforded to them. So if I give some examples of that, Greenhouse recently revealed that over 3/4 of employees would actively look for a new job or consider getting a new one if their company's hybrid work policies were reversed. That popularity is especially prevalent, we think, with those who struggle, particularly in the labour market, the over 50s, people with disabilities, and women or primary caregivers as well. Some recent YouGov polling as well has found that 68% of 50 to 64-year-olds want the right to work from home. And our Hybrid Work Commission, which I know we're keen to talk about today, has had similar findings as well. We founded the Hybrid Work Commission working with Public First, a consultancy, companies like Indeed, Vodafone, Northern Powerhouse Partnership, in order to kind of get to grips with what was really happening across the UK in the world of hybrid work. and how attitudes were changing. And I think there's a lot of complementary work in this Timewise report today. We found that 44% of those who self-reported having a long-term health condition wished they had more flexibility over where and when they worked. And we believe that with roughly 1 million job vacancies in the UK, this suggests that a prevalence of hybrid working can play an important role in reducing some of the challenges around economic activity and encouraging people back into work. This is something even that Chancellor Jeremy Hunt has sort of alluded to, that the UK could fill half the vacancies in the economy with people who say they would like to work despite being inactive due to sickness or disability. So hybrid policies backed up by enabling technologies applied in the right context around people's needs, we believe has huge potential benefits to the UK economy. One other interesting trend that we've seen is that hybrid female workers are already helping to solve the UK skills shortages. UK women in particular have benefited from that growth. A study a couple of years ago, over half of women said that in the past, a lack of flexibility had pushed them to leave or consider leaving a job. And we saw that during the pandemic, we saw a greater than normal increase in the number of women who returned to work and stayed back in work as well, helping alleviate some of the inflationary pressures in a tight labour market as well. I think there's sort of, I'm aware of time and that we don't have a lot today, but there's a huge amount that we can talk about in terms of the regional contribution of more hybrid and flexible work. It's a sort of thing that we're hearing a lot from politicians, including people like Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner. You shouldn't have to leave a job you love to do a job you love. And I think when we're talking about the kind of some of the regional inequalities, which is, I think, going to be very topical going into some of the political environment around the general election next year and so forth, there's a real opportunity with this push for more flexible and more hybrid to provide a different type of answer to the levelling up question. I'm aware I've already said quite a bit, but my final reflections would be, we always get at Zoom some questions about who we are and what we do. And we got a lot of headlines during the summer as we announced our own return to work policy, which obviously everybody sort of goes, what, even Zoom is got one. And it's quite interesting, because I think that what we've seen is often we see media debates, I think, around flexible work that can be very black and white. And what we wanted to do with our return to office policy was have it tailored and appropriate and provide incentive that makes it worth the commute penalty to come into the office. And we have a policy that in a certain fixed radius, we ask from the office, if an employee lives in that area, that they come in for 2 days a week, and we manage and curate really special team times together around that theme. So I myself am not based in that radius, but I find myself, I live in Devon in the southwest, but I come into London and engage with others, and I'm doing some government meetings after yesterday's reshuffle as well. So it's all we have to build roles which are flexible around different environments and so forth. It's a tremendously good report. We're really happy to contribute. We want to help and see where this work goes next. We've got a number of recommendations we'd like to see the government and others take up. I think a greater push for employers to mandate whether hybrid or flexible working is in a job, and that become the norm in advertising, we think will make a huge difference. But pleasure to speak today, and thank you, Claire and team, for your work.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was fantastic to hear some insights about the challenge that Zoom is on as an employer, as well as all of your thoughts more broadly. I think we're just going to have a quick look at our poll, which we have. Right, so 25%, that was kind of roughly half and half there, but the majority saying 49%, which is the correct answer, in fact. But the fact that there's a bit of a difference of views there shows that we have some way to go before all employers, as well as obviously employees, are aware of the legislation that is coming, that's coming in next year. Right, I'll turn now to our next speaker. Ben Harrison is director of the Work Foundation. And the Work Foundation publishes on a range of labour market policy issues, but also flexible work, and has particularly recently published work on the issue of flexible working, particularly in relation to disadvantaged groups, for example, looking at disability. So Ben, over to you.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks for having me, and congratulations, as has already been said, on releasing such a valuable and important report today. So at the Work Foundation, we're a policy unit with a history stretching back for over a century, and we've been part of Lancaster University since 2010. And we're driven really by wanting to understand and tackle structural inequality in the labour market, and in particular, how the things which prevent people from accessing good quality, well-paid and secure employment can be overcome. And that's really the lens through which we've started to look at this shift to flexible hybrid patterns of work over the course of the last few years. And ultimately, we think access to flexible working should be extended even further than the forthcoming legislation, which colleagues have spoken about this morning, will achieve, and ultimately become a day one right to request that flexible working. And really our sort of primary driver for championing that is we think it can be fundamental in efforts to reduce the chances of those facing wider structural disadvantage in the labour market from ending up in severely insecure forms of work. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by severely insecure work in a moment. And then alongside that, as Charlotte's just spoken about, we also think it would help address some of the labour market inactivity challenge that we've seen over the course of the last couple of years, and support more people back into the labour market. So firstly, on tackling severely insecure work and how that connects to this idea of enhancing flexibility in the labour market. We've spent the last 3 years exploring the nature of insecure work in the UK, and once you look beyond simplistic definitions of insecurity, like just looking at those who are in 0 hours contracts, and instead put those kinds of contractual arrangements alongside things like low pay and a lack of access to core employment rights, you find that around 6.5 million people in the UK today are in severely insecure work of one form or another, and that risks negative impacts on mental and financial well-being, as well as future career progression. Now, these severely insecure jobs may offer flexibility, but that tends to be one-sided flexibility, and that's the kind of flexibility where the employer dictates hours and pay and shift patterns, and where the employee tends to face a bit of a stark choice to either roll with that or to find another job. For some people, that can work, particularly if it's for a relatively short period of time. But for a great many more people, and particularly when it's over an extended period of time, we think that has really negative impacts. And we wanted to understand in that context why people find themselves opting into those kinds of severely insecure roles. And so in a study that we conducted in partnership with Unison earlier this year, we found that for many, it was essentially a lack of access to things like childcare, social care, good transport links to connect them to other kinds of job opportunities that were leaving people feeling like they had no choice but to essentially take more insecure work in order to balance wider pressures in their lives. And so in a sense, what you have is millions of people trading security for the flexibility that they need, and in doing so, absorbing volatility on things like shift patterns, working days, and pay. And in the context of the cost of living crisis that we've all been living through over the course of the last 18 months, 2 years, that's really serious. And I think, Claire, as your index shows today, those people can then get stuck in that kind of situation if they look at the jobs market and they see, I think the stat in your index today is 7 in 10 vacancies are seen as essentially off limits by those people because they wouldn't be able to manage those wider pressures that I've described. And that situation then kind of flows through into the kinds of worker groups that are most likely to experience severely insecure work. And this is where it essentially is reinforcing some of those structural disadvantages in the labour market. So, for example, women are disproportionately likely to find themselves in this kind of work. Our estimates are around 26% of working women are currently in severely insecure work in the UK, compared to just 14% of working men. And that becomes even more stark when you home in on parents. Working mothers with young children are nearly 3 times more likely than fathers to experience severely insecure work. So we feel pretty strongly that alongside curbing the law, reforming the law to curb more exploitative employment practices, we have to make secure jobs more flexible too. And then finally, then that issue around economic inactivity as well. So we know that since the pandemic, around 30% of the rise in inactivity within the UK labour market has been driven by those with long-term health conditions. And we also know that those with disabilities and long-term health conditions are about 1.5 times more likely to be in severely insecure work, again, driven by them trading security for the flexibility that they need in order to manage their conditions. And we feel there's a connection here between the quality and the flexibility of work on offer for those managing long-term health conditions and the extent to which many are ultimately opting out of the labour market altogether, because they ultimately feel that going into those kinds of jobs may ultimately have a detrimental impact, further detrimental impact on their health. And so if we're to support more of those people who want to work back into the labour market, then we feel enhancing the flexibility on offer within secure jobs, again, is going to be a really important component of doing so. Very quickly, a few caveats, I suppose. So simply extending flexible working isn't going to be a silver bullet out of the kinds of labour market challenges that we face at the moment. How flexible working is implemented matters hugely too. The extent to which leaders and managers implement policies in this space that are thoughtful and purposeful, particularly around how information is shared, decisions are taken, and engagement is sought across the workplace. If you get that wrong, then evidence suggests, and work we did with the Chartered Management Institute last year sort of underlined this, you might inadvertently create new workplace inequalities while trying to do a progressive thing and build more inclusion in your workplace if you don't think about how you do it really carefully. And then, of course, we're going to need to see big investments in things like childcare, social care, the skills system, etc. All of those other things which could support people into better paid, higher quality jobs. But certainly our research supports the work that you've put out today from Timewise, that extending that right to flexible working is going to be a really important part of the puzzle too. I'll stop there and hand back over.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ben. Some really rich insights there. And I mean, all of that really aligns with our findings, particularly the risks of people being pushed into insecure work as due to lack of flexible working. Just one question, Ben, before we come to our next poll and then open up for Q&A. Please do send your questions through. Obviously, there's talk of a recession next year, and I just wanted to get your perspective on what impact you think that might have on flexible working more broadly, and how employers might react.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's hard to know in terms of it's likely to play out significantly differently across different sectors, I think. But I think what periods of economic crisis, and the pandemic in a way sort of was an example of this, tend to accelerate transformation within processes within organizations, because organizations get a bit of a shock in terms of what's happening in their bottom line, or in terms of their ability to recruit, or other overheads and costs. And they have to think in different and more flexible and creative ways about how then they're going to respond to that from a kind of workforce perspective, as well as in other aspects of what they do. So I think what you could see, that if we do see a further downturn in the economy, then you may very well see organisations either accelerate existing plans that they have in place around flexibility. That may be extending it in terms of taking different decisions around physical office spaces, or where organisations are based across the country, or consolidating some of that down. Or it could be around actually thinking about, well, we need to sort of consolidate our colleagues back on site, because in a sense we're changing the way in which we do our work. So I know that's a little bit of a cop out of an answer, because I think it's quite hard to generalize ultimately. And I think what's certainly true is all organisations at the moment are facing a huge degree of uncertainty, and have been for some time now. And so I think that's a backdrop against which a lot of organisations are thinking about this, and potentially why you see a kind of degree of anxiety sort of play through in terms of what might happen if we were to extend flexibility in one way or another, because organisations are facing a kind of general environment of uncertainty more widely.
Great. Yeah, we're seeing lots of employers sort of hedging their bets,
yeah,
I think.
Yeah.
Right, let's go to poll number 2. So the question we're asking now is one that Charlotte touched on, which is what is the best way to encourage more employers to advertise jobs flexibly? And I'll ask each of the panelists there for their view on this, just so you've been warned. So there's 3 options again. Firstly, voluntary efforts from individual employers, which is where we currently are, really. Secondly, stronger sectoral guidance in best practice. And finally, government regulation to ensure more jobs advertised flexibly. So I guess along the same lines as we're seeing with the right to request. Claire, let me come to you on that one first.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you always want to pick more than one, don't you? But yeah, I think as I touched on earlier, we think the sector angle is really important. Firstly, because if you can myth bust, it wouldn't work here, it wouldn't work for us operationally, then by showcasing some organisations who are doing something different, who found a way through the kind of to make things work, then that really helps others see what's possible. And secondly, because everyone's a little bit competitive, if they're a neighbouring sector comparator down the road starts to do this, the pressure for them to think we've got to get on board, we've got to keep up with the competition is there as well. So yeah, I'm drawn to the individual one, but I think our feeling in terms of what works is strong sector guidance that kind of talks to what flexible working can look like in that industry is a really good way forward.
And Charlotte, I'll come to you. Sort of touched on this briefly. I kind of got the sense you'd like to see a slightly stronger position maybe from government, but it'd be interesting to see what you think.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I mean, I think Claire's points have been well made. I don't think it's particularly for large challenger tech companies to advocate for particular advertised protocol being mandated by the government. But I think what I would say is that the customers and partners that we talk to who are building in that hybrid and flexible approach from the off are seeing the returns in who they're getting applying, and the results speak for themselves. And that building in into your kind of people experience, your HR processes, something that factors in people, technology and process and brings them all together in a way that befits the job, but also befits the role, but also befits the individual is really important. Now that can require quite a different approach, and we're seeing people like CIOs and CTOs of large companies suddenly getting themselves into some of the questions that would have traditionally been the kind of mainstay of the HR director. And we're having to think much more horizontally about how we get that flexible hybrid tech enabled environment that's going to work best for the employers. But there are huge benefits to be had here. I think that the market and the advertisers will naturally start to go that way, but when we have the kind of national challenges now, inflationary pressures, skill shortages, there are real live economic gains for both employers and for UK writ large if we move to this much more quickly.
Ben, where do you sit on this one?
Yeah, I would broadly, I think, agree with both what Charlotte and Claire have said, really. And again, my instinct, similar to Claire's, would be to select more than one out of the list. But I guess for the sake of completeness, I think I probably would just re-emphasise that really clear government guidance and expectations around some of this is probably ultimately going to be very important for some parts of the economy and certain employers in order to do it. But I wouldn't see it just as a kind of compliance exercise. I think to be really successful and to sort of pick up on perhaps some of the things that Charlotte was just saying, I think the organisations who really see the benefits of this are those that are able to tell a story about the kind of organisation that they are, the kind of employment environment that they provide, and the fact that this connects to their kind of values and purpose as an organisation, that they want to be inclusive and that they want to live those values in how they organise themselves. And so it shouldn't just be a line on a job advert, but it should be something a bit more substantial than that, I think. And that in the end can help set you apart in a competitive landscape, I think, when it comes to recruitment.
Absolutely. Well, we'll come back to that when we've had the poll results. So we've had a couple of questions here on the flexible working legislation. So, I mean, we assume that people know about it. Not everyone does know about it. So the question is, what is it, and will it make a difference? Claire, if I just come to you first to explain a bit about what it is, and then perhaps I'll come to each of the panelists to get your sense on how much of a difference it can actually make.
Yeah, so this is a legislation we expect. I know someone asked about when. I think sort of spring summer next year. It was passed through Parliament in sort of July time. ACAS are working on the code of conduct and the guidance that will be accompanying it at the moment, and yeah, we expect it to kind of come into reality at some point first half or middle of next year. So essentially it's a change that means people can ask for flexible working from day one. That's, well, it's a sort of secondary piece of regulation that's being passed at the same time, but anyway, it's going to mean people can ask for flex from day one. It's going to mean that they can make 2 requests, which is double the number of requests a year that you can make at the moment. But more importantly, it's more obligation on the employer to consider what they can do. So rather than, at the moment, the current policy is very much, here are all the reasons you can say no. The tone of this one is, let's see what you can negotiate. What can you offer? Can you make it work? So a greater obligation on the employer to try and make it work. So I think it symbolises to candidates that the government is supportive of people's right to work flexibly. And so for me, that's probably the key thing, that candidates will feel protected in asking, and that they have a greater voice and a greater reason to ask for what they need. So I'm hoping that I foresee that's kind of part of the change it will bring about.
And Charlotte, look, one of our view really is that there's not enough understanding of best practice within sectors, or a strong enough sectoral voice when it comes to this legislation. You're obviously from the tech sector and speak for the tech sector. So what kind of preparation do you think, if any, the tech sector is doing for the legislation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, definitely. I'm on the Tech UK board, and I think we see a whole kind of range of reactions, and that can often depend again by size. It can depend again by part of the country that you're based in. So, I think on the whole, the tech sector is probably more of a sort of forward-looking. It understands that flexible and hybrid work is the norm. It was the quickest to adapt and provided the tools during the pandemic, and has always been one of those sectors, by having innovation in its DNA, that sort of seeks to look at what's possible. I think we're seeing a number of large and medium-sized tech firms also think more thoughtfully around, say, menopause leave, around how extending beyond the current norms we have on shared parental leave. These can really vary company by company, but it is a sector that I think is probably thinking more quote unquote progressively in that regard. But I think we're yet to see sort of particular norms settle or establish. I think we're still working out and innovating as a sector what the new normal looks like, beyond having a more nuanced approach to back to the office, work from home, which I think everybody's kind of there, that hybrid is the new normal. But for those wider policies and supportive environment, I think we see lots of different interesting examples popping up.
And Ben, I mean, we've touched on it, but the lack of access for frontline workers is obviously the massive barrier here. We're thinking about public sector organisations, thinking about NHS, thinking about schools, social care, particularly, where to move in this direction is incredibly difficult. What kind of preparation would you like to see those sectors taking, and is there more support that they need to make a reality of this legislation for their workers?
Yeah, so I think, just sort of briefly picking up on something Claire said, which I agree with, in terms of the fact that this intervention is a positive one, and I think it will have something of an impact on people's sort of sense that this is a good thing, or an okay thing to kind of do and to request on day one of getting a new job. I think there are limitations, and perhaps plays into some of the worker groups that you just described there, Claire, though, depending on the kind of power relationships within an organisation. And so, piece of work that I mentioned earlier that we've just done with the CMI found that essentially those who are in more insecure roles, more frontline roles, felt less able and prepared to ask their manager essentially for these kinds of flexible working arrangements, because ultimately they didn't feel like they had sufficient protections in their contracts or in their kind of relationship with the organisation, and that they would be seen as quote unquote difficult if they did, and therefore may end up losing their job. And so I think when we're looking at those more precarious forms of employment and employment settings, in a sense, that's why we don't feel this quite goes far enough, because it's unlikely to kind of support those people. I think the other group of workers that we'd be a bit concerned about as well is if you have a disability or a long-term health condition, placing the emphasis on you to raise this conversation with your employer might not be a comfortable thing to do. And actually it sort of would be potentially better if this was a conversation which was primarily initiated by the employer and as a kind of matter of course, that options were available, essentially, rather than it be a kind of discussion and a dialogue on day one. You know, for many people in those situations, that's not necessarily a risk that they can take to go through that process, have that conversation on day one, and then find the kind of flexibility that they need isn't available, even if other forms of flexibility are. So I think that's definitely challenging. Very briefly to your sort of specific point around kind of public sector and frontline workers, I guess what I would say is it's sort of seeing flexibility not just being about hybrid work, but also about the kind of broader range of flexibility that we can have through our jobs, whether that's start and finish time, shift patterns, etc. But that being not something which is just one-sided, where actually workers feel empowered to be able to have that conversation and essentially make that kind of flexibility work for them as well as work for the employer.
And I think we might have the poll results now. Lorna, yeah, great. So very few people think that the first option is the right answer there. So just voluntary efforts. The majority wanting to see more stronger sectoral guidance. That's really interesting. So quite, the audience here definitely more leaning towards mandation, which is really interesting. We've got lots of questions coming in now, so I'm just going to turn to the panel on one of these. So one question about the disconnect that there is between practice and hiring processes, and that's a really thorny issue. Claire, just to come to you in terms of what we see in relation to the work that we're doing with employers from different sectors and how that plays out.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, because we'll often challenge. We start working with an employer and we'll say, oh, we had a quick look at your job site, and you're not advertising any message around flexibility when you advertise, even though we're working with you, we know you're doing it. And the reasons vary. Very often we just never thought about it. We just assume a candidate would ask if they want flexibility. But we know, and as Ben has touched on as well, there are many groups who wouldn't. They just rule themselves out if they don't see that that's something they could talk to an employer about or ask for. So there's definitely an element of we just assume they would ask us, and it's kind of put back with them. There's an element of we just get the job advert out from last time and stick it out again. And it's how we've always recruited. So just kind of not being conscious that this is something they could do. And then, of course, there are managers who say, well, I've got quite a few flex workers already. I don't really want any more. I've sort of got my quota of flex workers on my team. And I prefer not to have to manage more of that. And I think that's where we need to do more work, obviously, to try and get over this idea that that flexibility is something you want to keep to a minimal number of people and it's disruptive, whereas actually we know if it's done right, it can be a real positive for how the team works and for recruiting and attracting talent, as we've said.
Great, and we've had a few questions on the survey itself, asking if we can break down our findings to protected characteristics.
I saw that.
We're able to cut by age, ethnicity, disability, and gender. We're quite limited in terms of the data set. It's a huge data set, but it is just job ads themselves that we're looking at. So we'd love to do more in-depth research. Perhaps that's one for the future. We've had a really great question on the sort of links between flexible working and the cost of living crisis. So a listener from Scotland who is seeing a shift in where people are living and working. So people increasingly needing to move out of cities to more affordable housing, which can be some distance from their usual workplace, and that kind of driving quite a lot of remote working requests to support that. So the question is, are we seeing this in other places? It's something that Rona, she sees as a real opportunity. Charlotte, do you want to come to that one? Because I guess that's very much linked to Zoom and its rationale.
Yeah, and it was something that we looked a lot at with the hybrid work commission that launched in September. I think there is this broader question, isn't there, of this kind of halcyon dream. Can hybrid and flexible working solve some of these fundamental economic challenges, which I know the Work Foundation and others do lots of thinking about? We have an economy that's very centralized around London and the southeast, and how can we unlock these benefits, these kind of jobs, particularly I think initially in kind of knowledge intensive sectors like legal and professional services, creative industries, insurance, etc. But I think increasingly the other types of roles will go that way as well. Now, we saw some research recently that said that the visitor footfall, which had increased in so-called kind of left behind towns, places like Morecambe, Skegness, Folkestone, Margate, the footfall and local retail actually increased quite substantially compared to 2019 as a result of more home working and more people putting the money back into their local economy rather than commuting into their nearest large town. Employers too have reported it being easier to recruit from larger geographic areas. So 51% of businesses polled with the Hybrid Work Commission found it easier to recruit from other regions, and were more and more getting used to the habit of sort of getting people who weren't necessarily based in London and the southeast, for those that were, say, maybe larger corporations with a London HQ or international presence with a significant presence in London. So I think there's a huge amount in that, and I sort of mentioned the quote at the beginning, this idea that you shouldn't have to leave a place you love to do a job you love. Well, I think there are some big questions about the sort of brain drain in certain parts of the country. And why do I say that? Does that directly tie to your cost of living type question? Well, yes, I think it does, because if you have local economies that have certain types of roles that then putting more and more money back into the local economy, that then helps support local high streets, other types of local industries, and there can be a sort of virtuous effect from that. There are often reported things around cost of living implications as well. Are staff saving money on their commute, or are they spending more money on their energy bills, having to heat up their homes for X number of days more a week? I think there are various ways we can cut this. We think there are benefits, for example, around the carbon footprint, as well as on cost of living implications as well. There are lots of studies done on this. I think the Hybrid Work Commission, I dropped the report in the chat, does look at a number of them. I mean, often it depends on the role, it depends on the how the employer is approaching that flexibility and remote and hybrid option. But I think once you start opening up more bandwidth for people to actually think about how can I best organize my life and my work as kind of in the round, you're going to unlock new types of it's going to help people manage their time and their money in slightly different ways.
Mm-hmm. We've had a question about the various different disadvantaged groups that we've talked about in terms of disabled people, older people. There's been no mention of race and ethnicity. Just to point out, we're doing some work with the Runnymede Foundation, which is looking at exactly that, the links between flexible working or the lack of access to it and the proportion of people from ethnic minority groups and different occupations. And we really think that's an incredibly important aspect of this debate, which hasn't received enough attention. Lots more questions, which I just want to try and cover a few of, if we can, before we have to wrap up. One question on the panel's own experiences of flexible working, looking for a flexible job in the market or being hired flexibly. Who wants to speak to that one?
I can, if you like. So yeah, I think very fortunate really in working for Lancaster and the Work Foundation, where I'm able to do a condensed week, which I'm able to kind of then balance childcare alongside and sort of share those responsibilities with my partner. If I look back over the course of my career in the different kind of policy units and bits of the government that I've worked with, those options were not in place, and it's quite hard to identify the extent to which the pandemic has a decisive impact on that shift, or whether that is something about different sectors, or sort of the general kind of shift towards more emphasis on diversity and inclusion. But we as an organisation that is all about improving access to secure jobs and see flexibility as an important part of that, have sought to make it a really kind of key part of what it is to work at the Work Foundation. So colleagues across the organisation, almost everybody, I think, engages in some kind of flexibility or another. And we've certainly found that has broadened our access to different kinds of candidates and talent pools across the country as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and many of us on this call, I'm sure, are the lucky ones to be able to benefit from that. We've still got the huge gap between different groups and people working different occupations that can't access flexible working. One last question, which I'd love to touch on, because our next event will be on the 5th of December, focused on part-time work. And so if the questions that we've had on part-time work do come along to that, so on the 5th of December. But there is a question about the changes in part-time working and what changes we might see on part-time work between now and the next index. As we know, part-time work is still very much still static in terms of the increase in numbers of jobs advertised with part-time working options, and it is overwhelmingly low-paid workers who are able to work part-time. So we're really keen to see more opportunities for people to work part-time. Can I just come to each of the panelists for their reflection on that particular point, and just any final reflections before we finish off? And Ben, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think we're particularly concerned around involuntary part-time work. So people who want to work more hours but find themselves only being able to access part-time work, we see that as a really important part of fixing the insecurity challenges that I mentioned. But of course, you're absolutely right. In other kinds of settings, part-time roles or kind of job shares and things like that can be a really important part of dealing with some of the issues that we're facing today. My final thought really is just to re-emphasize the fact that it's a really important thing, I think, to think about flexibility as being a kind of core part of all job roles, and that might look different, and that it doesn't have to just be about remote and hybrid working, which can sometimes sort of saddle the debate in an unhelpful way. And I think Charlotte mentioned earlier that it's sort of quite a black and white or stark debate that gets had about this, and actually really this is a kind of conversation that everybody should be able to have, and in some form or another, the vast majority of jobs can be undertaken in a more flexible way than they are today. And I think if we were to achieve that, then you'd see all kinds of positive impacts around inclusion and productivity around the economy.
Fantastic, thank you. Charlotte, just come to you.
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think so many of these parts are connected around part-time work, hybrid work, flexible work. I don't think as Zoom I would give any particular insights on part-time work, but I would say, I guess broadly echoing Ben, that we, employers, companies, organizations need an approach that really think about what am I doing to unlock the highest performance from this individual, my employee, and how am I creating the environment, the culture, and the technology that underpins that to help them be the best that they can be. And, for us as Zoom, we have lots of great products, which I could talk all day to you about how we help organizations of all different shapes and sizes try and get the best that works for their environment and culture. And, there will be cases where you have people on job shares, part-time work, where it's really important to be, clear and upfront about when somebody's online, when they're not online, that there aren't expectations. I think particularly for people with caring responsibilities, that they're not having to feel a pressure to be on when they're not being paid effectively, which I know is a growing concern. You've got to get the culture right, you've got to get the policies right, and you've got to get the tech right. And if employers can crack those three things, then it will go a long way.
Fantastic, Claire.
Thank you. Yeah, part-time. I mean, this is one I'd love to see the dial change on. We know there's an appetite, and again, actually, you see it in the 4-day week. The kind of all the fuss about the 4-day week is because people love the idea that they could be productive and work less. And so we know there's a demand, for people who would like to work less to, address balance in their life in one way or another. And we hear from employers all the time, and it's often a reason people reach out to us is they're losing people, they're losing their working parents, they're losing a lot of women from their organisation because they don't want to work in that particular long hours way anymore, and they want that bit better balance. So yes, as you say, Claire, watch this space for our next report, because we are trying to shed light on some of the issues around part-time, and that's something we will continue to champion and kind of push for quality part-time roles at all levels as we move forward. On the point about, what would we ask for employers, there will be pockets in every organisation of this going on flexible working being happening in practice. So there's something about just looking, an employer's asking us where to start, look inside your organization, find the teams that are making it work well, and then try and be transparent in your job adverts. If you can, just put that simple message: happy to talk, about flexible working, or come and talk to us about flexible working options. We know, as we've said, try it, see what candidates you get, but we think that's what we need to do to move jobs forward and to move forward with a more sort of a fairer, flexible hiring landscape.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And sorry we've gone over slightly, but we had loads of questions to get through. Thank you so much to all of you for coming, for the wonderful questions, and a big thank you to our fantastic panel. Enjoy the rest of your day.